먼저 아무리가 빨라지 이제 기름신이 쉬어 공시 유나면아 공시면은 내 단단 공화 대서 국자 동바시도와 예 아슈나. Would you like to come up? I don't know whether you're used to sitting cross-legged for long. So if you wish, you can please come up and sit here on the chair. Thank you. 이마 네 걔네 쉬우나 신천에 단지 슌게들이 7월 화매 봐. 슌게 7월 열배. 유나 야치 페나 다른 고급지 이런 거 양가 양세 제일 말해. Do you feel comfortable? 이만에 걔네 쉬우나 신천에 아니 시경 롱아 지휘 나와리야 아니 산에 타마니니 자투야 배전 쇼인 신쇼나 신신다 보트레나 타린 타마니와 아니 자리야 조신 고충부리 뒤뒤 엔트린데 뒤에기 도스임베기 전에 게는 마당 아니 산에기 어디 아주 쇼셨다 님만나네 우주 거슬라도 다시 막 공충원들이 같이 수대 패마죠. 테마도 지기 내가 어디 요요 쇼쇼 지시 아니 고조 죄송 나오는다 신주에 되게들이 지금 우리 축주를 우네 대배제 고조 시리즈도 어지도 한 대매매기다 눈에 수 시장에 패셔가 근데 공제바 가지 대도 우리 명한 사문하다 아니 쉽게 사문하리야 그러니까 주주에 문제지 나랑 결국 뭐네 언제니데 균에 예수나봐 성놀이야 다시 아까 주주뱅 뭐네다 나랑 결국 뭐네 삼주 테스트를 쉬어야지 단도 소수 계산하기 되는 랜덤 연주 쉬회 겁니다 오늘 대지 아메리게 서구 나와야 아니 비회지도 지당 먼저 서구 가슴 장엄들가나 서구 가슴 수루 쓰는 것도 지난해다 포틀랜드 누자 premier 소바소바 어디 차례나 중원에 음식 공시도 투마 내려야지 아주 외지도지 외배 코쇼샤 삼산업지 소화된 시청송 뒤뒤 찬수 갱신에게 단대 갱신에 이번에리 아니 예만 내고래 경에 망부시요리 참로리야 닝타원의 투시 신수기 그다음에 고급디다 답뒤체 엠프게 단대야 차보다 최대 고래 최대 사바지도 신신 엠프게리야 자야 그 고당 단단한테 랍지 갱신에 간라 소문나 신체제 엔나데 리베투 러시아니 자음식 센슈나시 디앙 그제 센디 캐스라 처음에 내주 숨도 하는 코 투주디 아주데 자야다 답주체 아니 이슬람 수기 시주당 듀체니 다니디 언제 제약이 곧 사무들이 충분히 아니 민관에 나 되는 수준에서 너럽당 traditional 당 아니 등도 좋아 modern traditional the modern 중국제외기 아니 리베기 동라시니 garden source garden of wisdom it's a combination of traditional and modern wisdom garden of wisdom yes 리더십 저는 제 sensory 19양 우리 kansu 단대 쉽게 방식이 지 등두기 음식이 로종 식이어리 이는 안수 표미기 여러 조상 환에 현지 지도를 실시야 진리기 고급 도신 중유주什么 음식 sensory 나만의 신신을 kansu 내던디 진리시간에 안로 두두 삼상 주시다 아니 마음바 티강이야 단도 숙실 조퇴하기 저지 신수유 안전하게 무르라다 콜라 고주 그래 윤시 서구 신발 단단한 지 중요한 지저 아무리 신지랑 천도네 향수 지도시 수익이 아니 생도기 차결도 도신나니 당기 내용을 나오나 신체제 그 지도시 수고 말이 수수 지도시 수익이는 수수 계열의 판도지 랑신 용화되기도 하고 자기들이 향수 미지 나올이야 근데 두면 수야지 향수 잘해 나나 때니 파마게 신발 파마 신발 수익이 부소리야 심슈 버려다 진리나 냠슈치야 안 다른 데를 빼랑시 별이주는 소고 시발주게 제주 최소에는 그 아무리가 롱거 지게 조단식이 삼바 그 조단기 케멘랑과 디베시 캐셔물의 예성도 그지 정말 내림마데 따임도 삼바 게시야 투주디 감시우샹아 시르샤는 그자 양양도 되어 쉬니 단단히 투주 대시망을 당셔요래 디디 점점 아주 대 자고의 고버더 경쟁이다 레림 방지에디 이 대시 맞춤배서시 그래서 아주 대 롱안나 테마니모도 자투고요 말이 다사지 제가 같은데야 같이 믹스의 기지 규정으로들의 중앙이나 아니 테마 솜스로도 변한 뉴욕다 미네소타스로들의 테마 솜스의 자야 중요를 말도시기 제마다 페미디게 상으로 쉬우지 먹으나 토르대요 사정하고 쉬우시나 야가지고 나오를 쓰기 가슴소 비슈어래 아니 데네수 단다 당기슈 내진신이 장암들과 나오를 약표게 지소다 숨주 수루식 별이 소고 요사 미만용 만들베기 단 추주주들에게 마고 쉬어래 데레인도 아니 자고의 금진 소디 별직수다 미망 바라는 양자와 탐섭 영화이시다 아주 망주름 쓰고 토네 아니 미망구 팬이 다 우리지 당구에 송상 아니 팬지야 계셔 주고 뭐 이마체체 여기 계셔베기 미디 내가 따다지 지도 미도 맞은거네 이메네 크란주 이제 신의 고기를 많이 계셔요도 맞은 크란주를 갱케고야 랭갸고야 지가고야 되게 고급디 다 될자베 걸마도 영화래 디두서바 아니 내든지 가시산에 대시로 시작투에나 아니 트랜스 페이지베 레든 시로 토리아 투벤지 수기리 삼체니 투주데시 망시는 게 가래 좋아 아니 그 롱안은 이미 탱기 모두 메디서만 대시 수세나 제위나 수술에 얘기에 관심을 cancer 슈 cancer 투벤 수야지 우리 투바치는 거리야 아니 cancer 양원의 공수 디레 요이나只是每年俺这来看团去，让新员工的，第二，他人就是在学校上上，人家选举空那么说的，通过全部团队下来那个多，第二，人家各电视上就是那改不出来这些片面上去，人家咱们去年选举出来呀，从头数字错误来，因为呢，他谈的俺们这个价位高了，유럽的话呢，데스탑 대학도 그래서 계급 망고 유주 아니 레니 되들이야 슝도 잘 아니 산주 되게 필요치는 소원도 자위나 그때부터 다 아무래도 자주 선별 슝이 말이야 말와 근데 아무래도 슝지 자주 필요 소원도 파주 거래견 자고 될 선별 상물로야 산주랑 자투에 대해 용어민도 그 공개 명시에 신수야 있는 다른데 레닌 캐디어레 팀도 미망우지 차례에 패디어레 공부 라는 말하다 그거리 나중에 뒤로 다다리야 남부술이야 자네 퓨투도 뭐투 되게 공기 아니 지카술에 캔슬돼야 공부 쉬어야 다들 뒤로 다다 중뭐 좀 되게 연구열에 되게 다리다 쉬게 가지고 되게 손자 이게 고급랑시 저기다 남부 상물로 벽에야 다시 경으로 와 상물로 경으로 와 내 벽에 난 대시 겸 디서브 프레젠테이션 등에 대해 샤샤 좋아 presentation ya kudu inji jingi je do kudu le des pame ya samse ya mena ne di mo je di inji na che an di je le ya nga du shu ge de ge ni phe na shu shina samse du shin maybe I'll take some time in explaining the global significance of Tibet in English first for the younger generation and then switch over to Tibetan for my later presentation. So if it will take some time because I come only 2 times in 5 years and this is the occasion that I become accountable and responsible to the Tibetans who put me in this position. So I have to be responsible for them. Now, oftentimes we speak about the larger issues, bigger issues, but we forget the basics. If we don't know the basics, then higher level things doesn't make too much sense. Also the fact that the generation that came from Tibet in 1959-60, including many elders here who were not educated when they came out into exile, but they were very steadfast in their devotion and faith in His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and committed themselves to developing this community, or the diaspora, Tibetan diaspora community. So I always take the opportunity to thank the older generation who have played a very important role in building this community, in following His Holiness' vision. That is also the reason why our generation is now able to take up the responsibility. Now, I was born in India. I've never seen Tibet myself. So to fulfill my emotional needs, I go to the Indian border from Ladakh to Arunachal Pradesh to see Tibet from the Indian side, even though I cannot step on the Tibetan soil, but this is just to fulfill my emotional needs. Now, one of our job, and we have this saying, and His Holiness keeps repeating this statement, that we have to hope for the best. So hope for the best, meaning that we will have, we may find a solution for the Sino-Tibet conflict by negotiating with the Chinese, if a sensible Chinese leadership come into that position. Right now, there is not much sense. So when I travel around the world, I sometimes jokingly tell our friends in these countries, if you have good surgeons, mental surgeons, then we have to bring all the Chinese leaders one by one, do surgery, put common sense and send them back. That's all they need to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict. And it's also incumbent upon us that the other part of this statement is that prepare for the worst. So hope for the best, prepare for the worst. So preparing for the worst, even if we have to struggle as a people for the next 30, 40, 50 years, because it is a fight for justice, as you mentioned earlier also. So then we will no more be alive at that time. Now I'm about 58, our generation. We won't be alive by that time. So the responsibility will fall on you, the younger generation, to take up that mantle of responsibility. That is why it is very important that you know the basics about Tibet, to be in a position to explain to other people why the resolution of Sino-Tibet conflict in a non-violent way that would be lasting is beneficial not only for the Tibetans, but for the whole world. So when we talk about the global significance of Tibet, you should also feel proud of being a Tibetan. So if you don't know about Tibet, then it's very difficult to feel the responsibility towards your cause also, right? So I have a short presentation here in English. Of course, we can elaborate and speak for hours, but I'll just stick to the basics. In the first slide, you will see, it's a satellite map. All the images that we have are satellite images. It's not hand-drawn. So from this satellite image, you can see how the Tibetan plateau is placed in the middle of Asia. It's in center of Asia, right? From this, sometimes I say you don't even need to draw a boundary, because the natural geographical formation of Tibet, because of the tectonic shift between the Gondwanas, or the Indian plate, and the Eurasian plate. The Indian plate went underneath the Eurasian plate, just like the African plate went under the European plate, So, and this Himalayan mountains came up, and the Tibetan plateau came up. And you can see how it is placed. And you can see the altitude also from this map. Now in the second slide, in the weekend Tibetan classes, also you recite this prayer, right, for the long life of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. The first line itself is Kangri Rave Korve Shinkham, right? So roughly in English, it's like the heavenly abode, the land surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Now, it's not enough to say Kangri Rave Korve Shinkham. You have to explain how it is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So in the next slide, you will see that in the south, maybe we should improvise this slide a little bit. We can get a better map and also, in future. But right now it shows in the south you have the whole of Himalayas, which extends from Afghanistan to Burma, through India, Nepal, Bhutan. So you have these high mountains. And in Medina district, DJ Yorba, to the culture slide. Yama, Chaka Chadiva. 이 제마디아 드레이어를 성원 시가 레이드. 네, 아니 그냥 쇼하듯이. 네, 좋아합니다. So how when we have to explain how it is surrounded by snow. So in the south you have the Himalayas, in the west you have the Karakoram ranges, and in the north you have the Kunlun ranges, and in the east you have series of mountain ranges. So that is how you explain to other people why or how Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges and why we call it Kangri Rave Korve Shinkham, the heavenly abode surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Okay, and then the next slide, the Westerners, of course, the immediate neighbors of Tibet we always had contact, but there are not many people who could come into Tibet because Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges. Those days you don't have aeroplanes, you don't have motorable roads, so you have to go by walk or ride a pony or horse to get across Tibet. And it's not all places that you can take pony also or horses. You have to walk a lot. And it's physically not possible for many people to come into Tibet, or physically not very easy for Tibetans also to go out of Tibet. So Tibet has remained isolated for a very long time. And the first, as far as I know, the first Westerner, the Jesuits who crossed over from China overland on Tibet and went back to Europe was sometime in late 16th century. Late 16th century. And the beginning of 17th century, Tibet became a fascination for the Christian world because they thought that Tibet is the last frontier where Christianity could not penetrate. And there were also myths that in the high mountains there are some lost Christians. And then a Portuguese by name Antonio de Andrade, he was the first European to cross over the Himalayas, go to Kuge in Deux, and started a Christian church for the first time in 1626. And around the same time, another group, this group went from Goa to Delhi, to Agra, Delhi, and then Tarchula and into Tibet. Another group went from Kerala in southwestern India, they went from Kuch Bihar into Bhutan, the present-day Bhutan. Around that time, the Bhutanese kingdom was also just being formed in 17th century. And they went to Shigaze, and they were the first to start a church in Shigaze. So since then, there have been a series of foreigners, or Westerners, particularly from Europe, who came to Tibet. And I read one book called Tibet Frontier Outpost by an American who was posted on China-Tibet border as part of the China mission, because there were a lot of Christian missionaries in China spreading Christianity in Tibet those days. And he wrote this book in 1906. And his son was the one who received Dr. Rinpoche in 1951 when he came to the United States and said, "Kyo demoina in Amdo, are you okay? Are you healthy?" And it was the same son, his son, who received Deshung Rinpoche and and the Penpa, all that in Seattle, 1960. So this person wrote this book, and one of the chapter in his book was titled as The Roof of the World. So maybe from that time, people started calling Tibet the roof of the world, or it may have been there before, described by Europeans, which I'm not aware of, but Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world. Then again, it's not enough to say why, not enough to call Tibet the roof of the world, but you have to explain how Tibet is roof of the world. There are several plateaus in this world, but Tibet is the highest plateau on earth. So when I was in Japan and in New Zealand, I asked them, which is your highest mountain? And they said in Japan it's Mount Fuji, and in New Zealand it's Mount Cook. And they said it's about 3,700, 3,800 meters. So at that time, I didn't have this presentation, so I had to give them an imagination of how high Tibet is, and I told them, your highest mountain is like base camp in Tibet. So you start climbing from there. You know, that's how high Tibet is. That is why it is called the roof of the world. So according to NASA, the average elevation is about 4,880 meters, or equivalent to about 16,060 feet above sea level. So that's how high Tibet is, and that is why it's called the roof of the world. And according to NASA, again, Tibet is the highest plateau on Earth, and then it's home to the highest mountain in the world, about 8,848 meters or 29,029 feet above sea level. And Tibet has an area of 2.5 million square kilometers, which is about 25% of China's total landmass, because China has 9.7 million square kilometers. Comparatively, Tibet is 18 times the size of Japan. It's 10 times the size of UK, and it's 30 times the size of Austria, just to give you a comparison as to how big Tibet is. So one time one journalist asked me, which is bigger, Bhutan or Tibet? You need 100 Bhutans to make one Tibet. That's how big Tibet is. And that also is an indication of how or why Tibet is important to the region and to the whole world climatically. And if you look at the map here, it's taken from the Bay of Bengal or southern India, and it shows Tibet's elevation, the natural elevation of Tibet. You don't need to draw a boundary around Tibet, right? And the next map also shows you, so next map also shows you the formation of Tibet. As I mentioned before, it came out of the tectonic shift between the Indian plate and the Eurasian plate, and scientists say that it was this formation of the Tibetan plateau started about 50 million years ago, right? And the human habitation on Tibet, as per the scientists, say that it dates back to more than 30,000 years. These are as per the latest findings, but they may have been civilization of people living on the plateau much before that, but scientists decide only on what they find right now, right? So this is according to what they say. So human habitation dates back to more than 30,000 years, and people, the geologists, the Geological Society of America also says that the Himalaya, because of the tectonic shift that's still happening, Himalaya is growing by about 10 millimeter every year, about a noodle thick. So noodles could be of different thickness, but let's say 10 millimeter every year. And then now, I think way back sometime in 1932, there was one person, I don't remember the name, but he had coined the name third pole for the first time, but it was not adopted or used by others around that time. But today, Chinese environmental scientists, next map. Now, the Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole. Now the other two poles are North Pole and South Pole, right? Now again, you have to explain why Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole, right? So if you go to the next slide, this also shows the permafrost, the ice, glacial ice, right, on the plateau of Tibet. So it's the largest reservoir of glaciers and permafrost in the world, outside the Arctic and Antarctic, and we are talking about 46,000 glaciers. And in terms of how much glacial ice it holds about 14,500 cubic kilometers of glacial ice. This is according to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and it's very crucial for global climate regulations. So when I visited Brazil last year, just before my visit, I came across a scientific journal where environmental scientists have studied climatic conditions over a long period of time and see how the correlation between Amazonia, which is the lung of the world, and the roof of the world, Tibet, even though they are on two sides of the world, two poles of the world, there are some correlations. They found that when there is a lot of snowfall in Tibet, then there was less rain in Amazonia. And when there is less snowfall in Tibet, then there's more rain in the Amazonia. So they found this correlation that's also implicated by the nature of the climatic conditions around the world. So it's not a concern. It does not concern only that region. It impacts the whole world. In the next slide, also you will see its source of. People say that Tibet's the climate change over Tibet impacts the rainfall in the whole region, and the jet streams that flow over the Tibetan plateau, and the impact of El Nino. El Nino is the warming of Pacifics. Both of these together, decides the climatic condition in the region. In India, it's called the monsoon, the rain, and it's also it also decides which are going to be the hot spots in India. And then the depression draws in the clouds, and then you have more rainfall in India. So these are decided by climatic conditions on the Tibetan plateau. That's how important. We are just talking about certain part, but it also impacts the other parts of the world. Then Asians call Tibet the water tower of Asia. Again, why water tower of Asia? If you look at this map, on the right hand side, you have these two rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze. In Tibetan, it's Machu and Dishu. Right? Machu is Yellow River and Dishu is Yangtze River. Now these two rivers originate from Tibet and flow into China, in northern China and southern China, and these two are the lifelines of China. Without these two rivers, China cannot support its 1.4 billion people. Right? And Yellow River is also cradle to Chinese civilization. Right? Then you have the Mekong that goes into 5 different Southeast Asian countries. It goes into Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand, and Vietnam. Right? Then there are 2 other rivers, Irrawaddy and Salween, that originates from Tibet and flow into Burma. Then you have the Brahmaputra. In Tibetan, it's Tsangpo. Brahmaputra starts from western Tibet, comes to eastern Tibet, takes a U-turn, and goes into India and Bangladesh. Now, at this place called, if you can put a pointer at at that spot where it's called the Great Bend, Great Bend, 그래서 그런 Great Bend, yes, there's channel to what Tande pass 어디 말디 국교 아직 내일 마다는 거의 뭐 매결 따예요 말에 technology is very difficult. The tea trade, the U-turn chester, the market home the way. Portland computer is high. Everywhere else it's working, but not here. So at this place called the Great Bend, China is building a mega dam, twice the size of Three Gorges Dam, which is the biggest in the world, right? And this dam is supposed to produce 3 times the hydroelectricity than the Three Gorges Dam. So by understanding that size, you can imagine how much water is going to be inundated upstream. That will destroy so much flora and fauna that's very unique to Tibet's altitude. And then also a lot of villages and townships and old temples and monasteries might also be submerged, right? But the future catastrophe could be, or consequence could be, that if something, I said this whole place is, the tectonic shifts are still happening and the whole region is a seismic zone. If something happens to that size of a dam in future, then what will happen to people in Arunachal Pradesh, in Assam and Bangladesh? They are going to be washed away, because you are talking about millions of cubic liters of water that's being stored for that kind, to produce that kind of a hydroelectricity, which could have serious consequences to the downstream countries. Then you have Ganges that originate from the Indo-Tibetan border, and then comes to India. You have another smaller river that originates from Tibet. It's not marked here, but Karnali, that flows into Nepal and then into India. Then in the west, you have the Indus and the Sutlej, right? Both of these 2 rivers originate from Tibet and goes into India and then into Pakistan. Now Indus, if you have read about old civilization, Indus is home to the Indus Valley civilization. So you can find the Yellow and the Indus, 2 rivers that originate from Tibet, are home or cradle to 2 oldest civilizations in this world. And the countries that we are talking about, from Pakistan to Nepal to India, Laos, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, and China, 10 different countries, are some of the most world's densely populated areas in the world, right? In the next slide also you will see is a source of 10 major rivers, and then it impacts, some environmental scientists say, out of the 8 billion people in this world, between 1.8 to 2 billion people have something or the other to do with rivers that originate from Tibet. So we are talking about serious, because China does not share hydrological data with any of its downstream countries. Forget about water sharing. So with India, just recently, just about 2-3 months ago, after the disengagement at the border, now Indian government is raising with China about sharing hydrological data. We have not yet reached the stage of sharing water, just sharing information on hydrology in the region. So we are talking about serious food and water security, because China uses Tibet's water like a water tank. If there is excess, they let it flow, and then you have floods downstream. If there is shortage, then they cut it off, and downstream countries have drought. And I've been to Thailand, I've been to Cambodia, and when I was traveling also, I used to read a lot of materials, and you can see that a lot of people downstream's livelihood being impacted because of China's control on Tibet's water system. China wants to control all resources. China is getting past. According to some estimates, China's underground water, about 60% of China's underground water is polluted, and about 50% of China's surface water is polluted. So Tibet's water is very, very important for the survival of the Chinese people. And now if you look into more details, there's another slide which shows how many dams Chinese are building on the Tibetan rivers. And heat waves and also heat waves in Europe are also determined by the climatic conditions in Tibet. Then the next slide will show you, this is a new report by International Campaign for Tibet. They have done a research, and just about 15, 20 days back, or about a month back, they can release this report. Here these are pointers as to where China has built dams or China plans to build dams. This year, May, June, we heard about a big dam being built in Derge and Jomda in Kham, right? Between Derge and Jomda on the Tishu. And that is just one among the 13 big dams they are planning on the upper reaches of the Yangtze. Now, if you look at all these dots on the map, we are talking about at least known cases of 193 dams. And the estimate is it can go up to 300 dams that China is building on Tibetan rivers to control Tibetan water. And if you look at some of the plans that Chinese government has, they are planning to divert the Brahmaputra also into China instead of letting it come into India. So these will have serious consequences in the downstream countries, particularly in India and Bangladesh. Then, when you talk about the geopolitical importance of Tibet, then you also talk about Tibetan history. I'll just give you a brief overview because this is very important, right? Because China claims sovereignty over Tibet in 7th century, 13th century, 18th century. Before 7th century, there is not much talk. But today, the so-called experts on Tibetan history from the Chinese side, of course, they have to speak what the Chinese government want them to speak, claim they even go back to Song and Tang dynasty and all that, but that has nothing to do with Tibet. Tibetans had nothing much to do with the Chinese also. So the first contact between the Tibetans and the Chinese from a political point of view was when King Songtsen Gampo had Wen Kongchu, princess of the Chinese emperor at that time, as his consort. And that's also the reason why China claims that Tibet is part of China from 7th century. So if in that case, then that same Tibetan emperor had a Nepalese consort, Prikudi Devi. So Nepal can also claim its sovereignty on China. That doesn't hold water. It's not enough reason. So Tibet from 7th to 9th century was a huge empire. In 8th century, during King Songtsen Gampo's time, Tizon Dezen's time, Tibetans invaded the capital of China. It's not Beijing of today or Nanjing of before that, but it is called the Xiangyang or Xi'an. We dethroned the Chinese emperor and put a puppet emperor there. And we even went up to present-day Samarkand in Uzbekistan. That used to be the size of the Tibetan Empire at one time, alongside the Mongols and the Chinese, right? Then Tibet disintegrated. And during that period, from 7th century, of course, there must have been a spoken Tibetan language before 7th century, but the script, I'm mentioning this because even I get asked questions about whether Tibetan language has anything to do with Chinese language or not. Because Chinese is pictographic, they don't have grammar, The Tibetan script came from India, because King Songtsen Gampo sent his minister Timmy Sambota to invent the Tibetan script, maybe mostly in Kashmir, because Kashmir was a hotbed of intellectualism of those days with Muslims and Buddhists and Hindus and all that. So the Tibetan script came from the Indian Devanagari script. Even today, when we recite, if I have to recite the Tibetan consonants, it's very close to Hindi. In Hindi, it's ka kha ga ga nga, cha 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 janya, ta 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 dana. We have only 4 vowels. Hindi have more, like a, e, u, e, o, aha, something like that. I don't remember everything. I studied Hindi only up to grade 8. So the similarity of language, because it came from India, and the Tibetan Buddhism also came from India. So if you have heard about His Holiness discourse on the adoption of the Nalanda tradition by the Tibetans, there was a debate between the Chinese Hoshangs and the Indian master, who was Kamala Shila, who was a disciple of Shankarakshita. And the Tibetan emperor decided that we will adopt Nalanda tradition of Buddhism. Right? Now, today, I'm saying all this because the Chinese government claims that Tibetan Buddhism also originated from China. That's not the reality. Even though Buddhism went to China much before it came to Tibet, about 4 centuries much before it came to Tibet, the origin of Tibetan Nalanda tradition comes from India, not from China. Right? Can't hold there. Is it okay? Or are you getting bored? If you're getting bored, then I'll switch to Tibetan. Then younger ones can leave. Okay. So Tibet was a huge empire from 7 to 9. Then Tibet disintegrated for about 400 years, from 9 to 13th century. But between that time also, even though there was not one Tibetan king who would rule the whole of Tibet, but religiously, spiritually, we made a lot of advances. So those were the period when Sakya tradition, Kagyu tradition emerged in Tibet. Right? Sakya Kagyu was the Marble Lord Sava and all that. The Marble Lord Sava traveled 3 times in India to learn Buddhism, came back to Tibet and introduced this. So, but even during that period, last year or 2 years before, I was traveling in Northeast India and I heard that Panchen Lama, one of the previous Panchen Lamas, had built a temple in Kolkata. So I was trying to find that on the web. But I also found that in 1206, when Genghis Khan was becoming a big power in Central Asia, Tibet was disintegrated, but even then, India was ruled by the Khiljis, and Khiljis sent 10,000 army into Tibet. The Khiljis were also responsible in destroying old Buddhist monasteries like the Nalanda and the Vikramashila and the Otantapuri, and they sent 10,000 army into Tibet from northern India. But Tibetans were smart enough to let them come in, and then they struck from top and middle and bottom, and it's said that only 100 people could return back from 1,000 or 10,000 marauding army of the Khiljis. So that also shows that even though Tibet was disintegrated, but the Tibetan frontiers were very well protected by the Tibetans, right? And then we developed relations with the Mongols around 1247 because the Mongols were merciless. If they want to capture Seattle, they come to Portland and they kill all the leaders. They don't follow any religion, right? So they were looking for a spiritual master, and they found it in the form of Sajya Pandita Kungwa. And his nephew, Chuge Papa, also went and became their spiritual master, following Sajya Pandita Kungwa. And then the Sakyabas started this Bönchen rule in Tibet around 1269-70. Several years after that, then the Mongols, Kublai Khan, invaded China in 1271. And that period between 1271 and 1368, when Kublai Khan and his successors ruled China, is called the Yuan period. But the Mongols were there even before that. Mongols were there even after that. But for the Chinese historians, the period between 1271 to 1368 is the Yuan dynasty, when Mongols ruled China, but not from Mongolia, but from within China, right? And Tibetans were ruled by the Sakyabas. Then the Mongols in China, the Yuans, were overthrown by the Mings. The Mings are real Han Chinese, today's Han Chinese, right? They were there, and they ruled China from 1368 to 1644, for almost 300 years. And Tibet, parallelly, was ruled by the Phamutuba for about 100 years, Rinpoche for about 100 years, Devatsangpa for about 100 years, till 1642. Now, if you are interested in history, then this is very important. 1642, the 5th Dalai Lama took over the temporal and spiritual leadership of Tibet. 2 years after that, the Mings were overthrown by the Qings. So it's not parallel. If China claims that Tibet is part of Ming, then how come there is this 2-year difference, right? And 1644, the Mings were overthrown by the Qings. If you watch Chinese kung fu movies, you will find that most of the protagonists are always Chinese, and the antagonists are Manchus. So the societal perspective of the Chinese people is that Manchus are not Chinese. So Manchus invaded China, and they also ruled from China. And the Ming, the Qings, Manchus are called the Qing dynasty. They ruled China from 1644 to 1911. And from 1642 onwards, in Tibet, His Holiness the 5th Dalai Lama and successive Dalai Lamas till today rule Tibet. Of course, every country has ups and downs with its neighbors. Tibet also has its influence from Mongols or Chinese, but does not necessarily mean to say that we came under their sovereignty, right? Then, from 1911, the nationalist movement came up. Kuomintang ruled China till 1949, and then they were overthrown by the communists, right? And we were ruled by from the 13th Dalai Lama till then the 14th Dalai Lama, and then we were invaded by China in 1950. At that time, the Tibet border was up to Chamdo. Beyond Chamdo in eastern Kham and whole of Amdo was a different story. Does not necessarily mean to say that it came under Chinese influence. Okay, they were ruled by independent chieftains and kings. So this is just to give you an overview of Tibetan history, so that if you find more time, then I would highly recommend that you read Tibetan history, written by Shakapa, Tsering Shakapa, The History of Tibet, and there are also a lot of other books written by Tibetans about Tibetan history. And if you get an understanding of how we define our history, and then how the Western researchers define Tibetan history, and how China tries to manipulate Tibetan history, then you will be in a much better position to be able to explain or even argue with others as to how Tibet was historically an independent state. So I have these two books. One is by Michael van Wall van Prague. I would highly recommend you, because you are anyway spending a lot of money for the organizations. I think you must be one of the very few Tibetan associations who really spend a lot of money on the activities that you organize. And I would highly recommend that you keep this also in the library, because this book is by Michael van Wall van Prague and Nick Voltius. We're going to meet with Michael in a few days from now, because he lives in Bay Area. And he looked at Tibetan history from an international legal perspective. Okay? And he worked, this book was published about 4 years ago, and he worked with about 100 scholars from Inner Asia, and proves that whether it's Tibet Yuan, Tibet Ming, Tibet Qing relations, or as per international law today, Tibet has never been considered part of China. And since this publication, China has never been able to respond or retort or argue back on the facts, right? So this would be a valuable book for you to read. Yeah, and I will circulate this. You make a phone parkyap and buy this from Amazon and read. If you don't invest, if you get book for free, then you don't read. Then you put it on the altar, and that's not enough. So you have to read. Then there is other book by a Chinese. He lives in San Diego these days. So I'm not able to go to LA at this time, but otherwise I would meet him with Professor Lau Hongxiang. He also published this book about 4 years ago, but this is in Chinese. The Tibetan version is already out. Sanjay Kyab had translated this, and it's published by the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives in Dharamsala. If you can read Tibetan, you can always buy one copy from there. But the English version should come out in about 3 months, right? And this professor, he's a Chinese, And he used to be intrigued during his university days when he was young. He used to be intrigued as to why Chinese government is asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC. Because when he was younger, he had heard that the Chinese government said Tibet is part of China since ancient times. If Tibet has been part of China since ancient times, then why does the current dispensation of the Communist Party is asking every government to say Tibet is part of PRC? So he became a professor his whole life, then he got retired, and then he went to pursue his dream. Even though he was a Chinese, he went on the Communist Party website and he downloaded all the materials from Imperial China. Because the Chinese are known to have a very meticulous system of maintaining records. So when the Yuan dynasty finished and when the Ming came in, they revised the whole Yuan history. And when Ming got toppled by the Qings also revised all their previous history. So it's how meticulous they are, you know. So he looked at all those, and this is not written in a historical format. It's written more in an argumentative format as to how Imperial China has never considered Tibet as part of China, right? So these are two books, and even though our official position is middle way, so when we say middle, then we talk also about the ends. Without ends or polarities or extremities, there are no middle. They cannot be middle. Right? So after we came into this administration, in this 16th cabinet, of course, we follow the middle way policy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We are very committed to this. Now, we have to apply our mind whenever a new administration comes into position. We have to apply our mind as to how do we achieve that. Right? So we decided to change our strategy a little bit, because within the Tibetan community, there's also the thinking that if you say middle way, you cannot talk about history. That's not the case. Even the people who espouse independence for future Tibet, like the Tibetan Youth Congress, every 2-3 years they have their annual meetings, and then they have an audience with His Holiness, and His Holiness always tells them, if you are seeking, since you are seeking independence for future, which they have the right, Tibetan people have the right to seek independence also. So if you're seeking, then you have to prove the independent status of Tibet in the past, right? So on that similar thinking, we are now following middle way, but to gain value for middle way, gain leverage for middle way, then we have to seek recognition for the polarities. One polarity is the present situation of occupied Tibet under the repressive Chinese government. And the other polarity is the historical status of Tibet as an independent state. So that is why, to seek that recognition, this cabinet just didn't do talk the talk. We walked the talk. So you know about the Resolve Tibet Act. Your people, all of us have played a role. We did a strategy meeting with Speaker Emerita Pelosi and our friends at the Hill, and we decided to adopt this, and then people started drafting the Resolve Tibet Act, and it took a little more than 2 years to get this bill passed. From November last year in the House, from November 26 in the House, November 26, 2023, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, we got unanimous support. And then it went on the floor. By April 15th, 16th of this year, it went on the floor of the House, and we got 293 votes out of 431 members present there to vote at that time. Even those who opposed or abstained were not against the bill as such. They wanted to make it stronger, particularly from the Republicans. So I was saying it's more like unanimous decision of the House. And then in June, it was moved to, April, sorry, I'm getting mixed up. In the House floor, we got it done by 15 February. Now in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, then it got passed unanimously on April 16th. And then we got it through hotline, what is called hotline. It's a process in the Hill where you have agreement of all 8 corners. 8 corners meaning the House leader, Speaker, and the Minority Leader, the Senate Majority Leader, Minority Leader, and then House Foreign Affairs Committee as a Majority Leader and Ranking Member, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee's Majority and Ranking Member. So if all 8 of these leaders agree, and if there is not one objection from a single senator, then it gets through the hotline. So we got this through hotline, and now it's a collective effort of everybody. You have played a lot of role in getting your senators, and in fact, Senator Merkley is a co-sponsor of this bill from the Democrat side, alongside Senator Todd Young from the Republican side, right? So we express our thanks to Senator Merkley last time we were at the Hill during this visit, and that's also because of the effort that you have played in your state to convince your senators and House members to get support for this bill. And now it has become an act when President Biden signed it on July 12th. And now we have one more instrument in our hand, and we have to work with other like-minded countries to see how other countries can adopt similar positions so that we'll put pressure on China, and China will have to come and talk to us. So that's the whole idea. Okay, I'll stop that much in English, and I know some of you are getting bored, but I don't think you will get too many opportunities to listen to Sikyong and talk about these things, right? And hopefully it was useful. What do you Now I'll shift to Tibetan. What's ritual? 모바일 다 드레키지 아니 뒤주지 장